We all know that in our timeline, Alexander conquered Persia and died soon after in Babylon. So what if that changed? What if Alexander lived longer? Even though Alexander died, we do know about his plans for future invasions in Arabia and North Africa. Despite this sounding like a bad idea, since stabilizing the land you just conquered from the Persians would probably be a much better idea, it is very likely that Alexander spends time trying to consolidate the lands he invaded, because even if Alexander expands his empire, there would still be people trying to revolt because of cultural and religious differences. So, for this alternate timeline, we are going to assume that Alexander, although probably unlikely, spends time promoting stability in his empire before going on to conquer more lands. After these couple years of strengthening his empire and paying his soldiers their salary, Alexander marches on Alexandria with his new army formed from the people he had just conquered. He offered these people great opportunities for joining his army. In fact, these people are starting to prefer living under Macedonian rule than Persian. Alexander begins his campaign into Arabia. Now, it is important to mention that his plans probably didn't have all of Arabia in mind, just the coastal parts. He easily manages to conquer Western Arabia as his army is way superior compared to the Arabian tribes that he is fighting against. After this conquest, there are two possibilities. Either he tries to conquer more of the Balkans, which is probably the least likely to happen, or Alexander starts his campaign into North Africa. He easily once again manages to conquer without competition. He manages to conquer modern-day Libya. This episode of conquest seems to be quite easy for Alexander until one big country interrupts him, and let's just say this isn't going to be pretty. Carthage in this timeline is angry at Macedon for threatening their security as an empire. They fear that Alexander could conquer them next. Carthage could definitely put up a great fight against Macedon, but they are inferior compared to Alexander's army. Alexander sends an ultimatum to Carthage demanding they cede many lands to Macedon. Now, clearly shooken by this, Carthage declines due to these lands being very important for their trading empire. Alexander declares war on Carthage. The war that is coming will be absolutely devastating for both sides. Both sides lose a bunch of soldiers trying to fight each other, but eventually Alexander and his generals manage to break the stalemate and they siege Carthage. This sends shockwaves of unrest across their empire, and many states in Carthage begin to break away and form their own nations. This includes tribes in Sardinia and Corsica. And some Berber and Spanish tribes also begin to break away. Taking advantage of this, Alexander sends some soldiers and ships to quickly conquer Sicily. After this, Carthage completely collapses. It is very well possible that in our timeline without Carthage, the history of the world would be changed forever. Rome would still expand to the heights we saw in the First Punic War, conquering most of Italy, but it would be hard to say whether or not they would have free reign to dominate the Mediterranean Sea or stay a regional power. Rome may have not developed the ships we saw in our timeline due to not needing them as much. But it is still very well possible that Rome goes on to conquer some parts of the Mediterranean Sea, including Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. It's hard to say whether they would still conquer the region of Carthage, since in this timeline there would be no Punic Wars. But on the contrary, they probably would have conquered Carthage due to its close proximity to Sicily, and it would be an insane control point for the Mediterranean Sea. It's possible, though, that the Roman Empire as we know it in our timeline simply does not exist. Of course, Rome would still expand, but their influence wouldn't be anything major. Back to Carthage. Their generals and soldiers desert, and even many of their soldiers decide to surrender to Alexander the Great. By no means, though, does this mean Macedon would be quite stable. Actually, quite the opposite. His empire has huge unrest across it, despite Alexander's attempts at stabilizing it. Alexander is now getting old, and he is already 37 years old. His generals and doctors begin to worry that Alexander may die soon. Alexander's son, Alexander IV, is already about 5 years old and definitely not old enough to rule yet. Alexander needs a stable successor if he wants his empire to survive, so he makes the bold decision of giving the succession of the throne to his general Hephaestion. But he certainly wouldn't rule too long if Alexander dies. Alexander, getting old, wants to go on one last conquest. Him and his generals ponder on where would be best to conquer next. But in this alternate timeline, Macedon is facing problems with barbaric invasions from the Danube River and the Balkans and also the Caucasus region too. Alexander decides that conquering the Caucasus first would be the best decision. Him and his army quickly conquer the Caucasus pretty quickly. Alexander is already tired, but he knows he can't let down his army and his country. He then puts his eyes on the Balkans, starting a war with the many tribes there. After some time, Alexander conquers these lands. After this conquest, though, Alexander is now 38 years old, and he has catched many diseases from these conquests. He is so sick that he needs to return to his palace in Pella to recover. After a couple weeks, Alexander's health begins to further deteriorate. His general Hephaestion is also very sick, and at this point there is only one clear successor, and that is Alexander IV. Alexander the Great dies of typhoid fever in 329 BC in Pella. His son quickly ascends the throne, but there is a clear problem here to be addressed. Since Alexander IV is very young, he is vulnerable to usurpers and generals who want to claim power. And unfortunately, in this alternate timeline, Alexander becomes a victim of this and is killed by one of his father's generals called Cassander. Wow, what a betrayal. After this, many countries begin to break away from Macedon, including, but not limited to, Egypt, which Ptolemy and his descendants will now rule. Seleucus Nicator decides that this would be the perfect time to start his own empire, the Seleucid Empire. He quickly breaks away and forms his own empire without trouble. But in this timeline, it would be way smaller than it actually was, since the Persians also break away too. This is where I will end this scenario. We can imagine that in the future, Macedon continues to deteriorate due to unrest and bad rulers.